Hello everyone. We have our orthographic all drawn out in Photoshop, and now we can actually start getting into Maya and setting up our scene and our project. Now there is sort of one thing I want to touch on projects before I get into actually creating our project and setting up our scene. It's important to set a project. Um, I think it's very important to set a project. However, sometimes using all the default folders and whatnot can be a little nerve-wracking. And I just want to talk about that in a little deep detail before we get started. So, like I said, it's always important to start a project. And before we start our project, or actually to actually start our project, I'm going to go to File, Project Window, and it's currently set to an older project that I have, so I'm just going to click New. And I have my location set by default, and that's pretty much where I want it. So I can create a project here. Now, by default, you're going to have all these sort of default folders that are going to create. Maya is going to create for you. Now, if you're working on a whole scene or a whole sort of movie where you're rendering images, you're creating light maps, you're using normal maps, you have all this different stuff going on. So you're going to need like a scenes folder, and you're going to need an images folder and a source images, a render data, sound, scripts, data. You're going to need all of these files if you're working on an entire project like a movie, a short film, or even a little clip of a movie. However, whenever you're just modeling a character, you don't need all this stuff. And I find it a lot easier to just work out of everything being in the same folder than having to deal with all of these different files or directories in a project whenever you're just modeling a character, or just a single asset. And the reason is that way you know where everything is. Probably one of the areas that things get most mixed up is like the images and source images. So you're always like, well, I can't remember if I put that in the source images or the images, and you're looking around for it. And your scenes, if you have like a Maya scene, will be in scenes, or if you have like a OBJ file, it will be under data. And it just gets really confusing trying to figure out which folder everything is in. So rather than creating a project folder here in Maya, what I like to do whenever I'm just modeling a single thing is I'll go to my directory and my projects where things just save automatically here, and I'll just create a new folder, and I will name this the elf underscore project. And that's going to be my scene folder. And essentially, I'm going to keep everything inside this one folder. So that way I know where everything is. It's right out there in the open. And because I'm just modeling one character, I'm not going to get a lot of files in here. Ideally, when I'm done, I'm going to have a Maya file and a few texture files, and that's it. I won't have anything else. This also makes it a lot easier when you're turning projects in a classroom setting, because you're not going to be turning in something that the instructor doesn't need to see. You're not going to be turning in like a bunch of different iterations of the same file. This way, because everything's in one folder, you can just sort of click and drag and put everything in one folder and be done with it. You don't have to give the instructor your entire project with a bunch of unnecessary files in it. So this is the way I like to work whenever I'm modeling. And typically, even in a studio setting, whenever you finish a character model or any asset model, you're going to turn it in either with the model and the textures in two different folders, or having them both in the same folder together. A lot of times there's a predefined directory set up for any given studio where you're putting things in specific folders that don't really match up the Maya project folders. So this is the way I like to work. Rather than creating a file or a project with all those predefined directories in it that Maya's going to make, when you're just modeling a character or any single asset, just create a folder. You'll make that your project, and you'll just throw all of your files in that project. So now, rather than going to my project window and creating a new project, I already have that folder created. So I'm going to go to File, Set Project, and I'm going to select that folder, ELF Project. So it does need a project definition file, so I will create a default workspace for that. I'll go ahead and save just a blank Maya file for now. So I will save scene as, and since we're going to be starting modeling the head, we're just going to be starting with the head. I'm just going to name this first file ELF head, and we may change this. Actually, let's just go ahead and name this ELF underscore character, because I can always save the head off by itself, which is probably what I'll do. So then I click Save As, continue there, and I want to put my orthographic views in that folder also. So I'll bring up Photoshop. I'm going to go to Save As, locate my folder, ELF project, and ELF orthographic PNG, save. So now if I just open up that folder just to see what we have, project. So I just have 3 files. I have this temp file because Photoshop's still saving that PNG file. It'll change in a second. But that's all I need. I don't need a bunch of different directories to be confused about where I put things or accidentally put something where it doesn't belong. I have everything in a single folder, and everything is exactly where I know it's going to be. Okay, so now let's, once Photoshop finishes, there it goes, we can close Photoshop and we can jump into Maya and start talking about setting up our scene to begin modeling. Now, I always think scale is really important in a scene whenever you're modeling something. So I like to start out by creating a cube that's kind of going to be the right scale. And there's some problems that will be caused whenever we make something that's actually to scale. So we'll talk about that as they arise. So I want to think about how large my elf creature is. So probably not super tall. I envisioned him as being sort of a smaller character, so maybe like 4 feet tall, and that's probably a good place to start, is 4 feet. So I'm going to create a cube by going to Create, Polygons, Cube, and I want to look at the scale for that. So at the moment, all my translates are set to 0. My scale is 111. But I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at here, if I'm looking at centimeters or inches or feet. So to get to that, to actually change the scale of our grid, is going to be under our preferences. So Window, Settings, Preferences, Preferences, and then it's going to be under settings. So if you just click on settings, here we have now our working units. So at the moment our working units are centimeters. And that's all we need to know for now. If I want to change this to something like inches or feet, I can do that. And a lot of times what's going to happen is your Maya is going to reset. It constantly resets back to centimeters. So every time you create a new file, it's going to reset your working units back to centimeters, just because that's the default. And a lot of game engines and other things that you may end up importing your character into always works off of centimeters. So it's a good idea, in my opinion, just to stay in centimeters. Now you can either figure out how many centimeters are 4 feet, or you can just switch it to feet, and you'll see when that happens, my grid gets a lot bigger and my cube gets a lot tinier. So let me go ahead and delete that cube, and I'll create another one. So create polygons cube. Now we see that this cube is a lot bigger because every cube is always created to be 1 centimeter cubed, or whatever your working unit is, to be one of those cubed. And since we created that whenever it was in centimeters, it was 1 centimeter cubed. Now we're in feet, so our cube is 1 foot cubed. So the easiest way to go in and change the scale of this cube and to get it to be exactly 4 feet tall is to go over to our scale Y. So scale Y is going to be our up and down scale. And then I can just change this to 4. So now I know that our cube here is exactly 4 feet tall. I can switch over to our front view, and I just want to move that up to be right above the grid. So now I know for a fact that our cube here is exactly 4 feet tall. Since it's important to kind of stay working in centimeters, now that I have this cube created, what I'm going to do is switch back to centimeters. So I'll go to Window, Settings, Preferences, go to my settings, and I'll switch this back to centimeters and click Save. So our grid is very tiny again, but we have a cube that's exactly 4 feet tall. So it'll give us sort of an idea of making our object proper scale. So the problem is with working with things at scale is that our camera isn't set up to work on large objects. So what's going to happen if you begin to zoom out here? If I zoom out really far, at some point you're going to get some weird graphical issue around your object, and eventually it just disappears. If I let's go ahead and make just to kind of demonstrate this, I'm just going to make a sphere and scale this guy way up. So this guy is probably about 20 feet by 20 feet. So if you have a really large character, like a dragon or something, you're definitely going to see this happen. But what's going to happen is as you zoom out, your sphere is just going to disappear. And that's because of the clipping plane of the camera. So before I ever start modeling, I do need to go in and change some settings for our camera. So I'm going to go to over here in my viewport to the very top left and just click that camera, and that will bring up our camera settings. And I'm going to go to the attribute editor. So we're going to see a few things here. We're going to see a angle of view, a focal length, and then we see a near clip plane and a far clip plane. So the problem here is that our far clip plane is set to 10,000 centimeters, and since our object here is 700 centimeters, 10,000 isn't very big. So once we get further than 10,000 centimeters away, it disappears. So to fix that, we're just going to go back over to our camera settings, and instead of 10,000, I'm just going to add a bunch of zeros, like 4 or 5 zeros, and that will kind of fix that problem. So now we're going to need to get quite a bit a ways from our object before it actually clips out. Now, the other problem that's going to happen whenever this happens is this is a general known, well-known little glitch in Maya's viewport. Is you may notice that there's some glitchy things happening whenever I get really far away, and that's actually because of the near clip plane. So it's just too low. So rather than, and since we're modeling to scale here, we're never going to need to really get 0.1 centimeters away before it clips out. So I'm just going to set this to 1. So now when we get 1 centimeter away, it's going to clip out, and we're going to see inside of that. So, and then that will help that glitchiness happen. So now I can zoom way out, and I don't really get any weird artifacts happening there. So that's one thing I always like to do right off the bat whenever I'm starting a new model. So I can delete that sphere. Now another problem we have is our camera focal length. What's going to happen when we're modeling ahead is, let's go back to our camera settings here, is whenever we get really close to it, let me see if I can make a quick example here to explain this. So say this is our character's head, and just give him a quick little nose at the end. Now because our focal length is set so low, when we get really zoomed in, things are going to get really distorted with our perspective. So what's going to happen is, as we're working on things like the nose, we may not see the ears because our focal length is set low, and it's not really something the human eye is, or a way the human eye sees. So what we need to do is come in and change our focal length a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my camera settings, and let's change our focal length to 50. Now 50 millimeters is, and this is just like camera settings. You know, if you have an actual DSLR camera, your angle of view, you know, it's changing the type of lens you have. So 50 millimeters is a lot closer to the focal length of our eyes than a 35 millimeter. So I like to go in and just change that to 50. And now as we zoom in, we're not going to see such a bad perspective distortion. You know, we would be able to see the ears. It just makes your viewport a little more like your actual eyes. So your model is going to look more right as you're modeling it. Okay, so just to recap those two things, I made sure that my cube is to scale by changing the working units and then changing them back to centimeters. So I have a 4-foot cube. I changed my my camera clipping plane really high, and I changed my near clip plane to 1, and then I changed my focal length to 50. And this will just help our camera look a little bit more realistic, or what we would be used to seeing with our own eyes. Okay, so the next thing I need to do really quickly is just bring in our orthographic view, and then we'll be ready to start modeling. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to jump over to my 4-panel view, and let me zoom out here on all of them. So you'll notice that our grids don't exactly match up here. They should whenever you zoom out far enough. But that's okay. We can sort of change those. And now I don't have a top view, so I'm not really going to bother with that. But I do have a front and a side view. All right, so to bring in my image plane, I'm going to start with the front view, and I'm just going to sort of hit my space bar so I only see my front view here. And then I'm going to go in my viewport window, not up here, go to View, Image Plane, Import Image. And because I have that project set and everything's in one file, I don't have to go looking for that. So I can just click Open. So that brings it in, but it's not really where we want it to be. So the elf, the front view of the elf isn't in the center of our grid, and it's kind of small. It doesn't really match up to the size we want it to be. So we need to scale it up first of all. So I'm going to just select my image plane, and I'm going to go to my scale tool and begin scaling it up and moving it around until my elf is about the size of that cube. And this is something I want to keep in mind. So right now I have my scale to 4.159. That's something I want to remember because I'm going to need to scale my side view up the exact same amount. So I'm just going to make that an even number of let's do 4.2. So that's an even number. And I also want to bring my character to bring it up a little bit, which I already did, but I do want to note, what that translate Y is as well. So I know to bring my side view up the same exact amount. So I'm going to go to translate Y, and it's at 56.057. So I'm just going to make that 56, and that'll be an easy number to remember. Now the translate X doesn't really matter so much, so I'm not really going to make note of that. I do, however, want to make sure that my model is in the exact center of the grid. So to do that, I want to make it a little bit see-through. So I'm going to go down here to alpha gain, and let's just make that like 0.8. And you'll see that now my orthographic sheet is just a tiny bit see-through. Let's make it 0.7, just a little more. And I want to zoom in and make sure I get that center grid line right down the middle of my character. So that's pretty close. Doesn't have to be meticulously exact, but that is pretty close. All right, so I have my everything in position. There is one other position I do want to change. And if I jump over to my perspective view, we can see our image plane in our perspective view. It's sort of sitting right there in the center of our grid. This can cause a problem. If I move my model at any point behind that image plane, it's going to cause a problem seeing our model and selecting our model in certain points on that. So rather than having my model be moved, I want to move my entire image plane back in space. So to do that, I'm just going to go down to my image center Z. So Z is going to move it back. So I'll click on image center Z and just click and drag and move that back in space. I don't want to move it forward because then you're going to see that it may go past our camera. I want to move that back in space. Okay, somewhere like that. And I also don't want to see that in my my perspective view, because if I ever go behind the character, that may get in the way. So one last thing I'll do is go over to my attribute editor with my image plane selected, and I want to click on display looking through camera instead of in all views. That way it's only going to show up in my my front view. So then it disappears. Now this thing right here is my front camera. I don't know why that showed up. I can get rid of that just by hitting Control H to hide it, and that will disappear. Okay, so we have our front image plane set up. So now we can do our side. So I'm going to go to my side view here. I'll go to View, Image Plane, Import Image, select that same file, and remember, we scaled this up and we moved it a certain amount. So we need to check again and see what those other values are so we get this in the exact same spot. So I'm going to select my first image plane, go to my channel box. So our translate Y is 56 and our scales are 4.2. So rather than eyeballing this, we can just go into translate X and type in 56. Oops, that was translate Y, I believe. And we can go to our scales and type in 4.2. So now it's in exactly the same spot. And then I can just grab and move this guy over so he's kind of existing inside of that cube. So again, we can see this in the perspective view, and I don't want to. So I want to go to my image center X this time, and I want to move that back. Oops. Image center. Maybe, nope, not Y. I'm not quite sure why that's moving like that. I think it's because we have this weird translate Z, which should be 0. Something weird's going on there. So let's go ahead and zero all of those out. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. This happens. We just have to kind of figure out what we did wrong and move on. So translate Y needs to be 56. Translate Z, what we want, and then image center X should move back. I don't really know why it's doing that, but that's okay. Instead of moving it back here in image center, I can just grab it and move it back and translate X instead, and that should work just as good. I think there's some history in there they're connected to each other, so that's why it doesn't really want to work quite right. So I just want to move it back. I don't want it to be in the center of the grid where it's going to get in our way. Okay, so then I want to drop my alpha gain again down to something like 0.7 to make it slightly transparent. And I want to go to my attribute editor and go to click on display looking through camera. So now we're not going to see it in our front view, but we will see it in our side view. All right, again, that's our front side view camera. I'm not quite sure why it's showing up there, but we can hit Control H to hide that. And we are all set up and we are ready to start modeling. I no longer need that cube, so I can delete it. And I can actually start modeling the head, which is what I'll do in the following video.